The radio call came in at 0247, and the only reason anyone remembered the exact time later was because the duty log was the one thing that didn't get questioned afterward. Kestrel TOC, this is East 2. I have movement 400 meters outside the wire. Requesting permission to illuminate. The Tactical Operations Center took 6 seconds to respond. That was longer than usual. The man on duty, a staff sergeant named Voss, said later that he hesitated because the request itself was wrong. East 2 wasn't supposed to be calling for illumination at 400 meters. That was inside the standard observation envelope. You watched at 400. You illuminated at 200. Calling for light that far out meant the soldier on the tower had already decided something was off, and was trying to make it official before describing it. East 2 Kestrel. Confirm nature of movement. There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice came back, lower this time, almost careful. Kestrel East 2. I'd rather not say over the net. That phrase, I'd rather not say over the net, wasn't a phrase you used in a forward operating base in the middle of a deployment. It was the kind of thing you said when you didn't want to be on record yet, when you wanted a witness in person before you committed to a description. Voss authorized the illumination. The flare went up. And for the next 4 minutes the East Tower was silent. No correction. No follow-up. No standard observation report. Nothing. When the relief came up the ladder an hour later, the soldier on duty, a corporal, 22 years old, 2 years in service, a clean record, was sitting on the floor of the tower with his back against the sandbag wall. His weapon was beside him. The optics were turned off. He was looking at the door, not the wire. And when the relief asked him what he had seen, he said only one thing. He said, "It wasn't doing anything." That's the problem. There are certain categories of military report that don't fit cleanly into either of the two boxes most people want to put them in. They aren't dramatic enough to be ghost stories. They aren't operational enough to be incidents. They sit in a quieter middle territory, the kind of accounts you only hear about when someone trusts you enough to bring them up, usually years after the fact, usually after a few drinks, usually with a particular look in their eyes that suggests they've thought about the thing more often than they'd like to admit. I've been collecting these accounts for a long time now. Most of them are mundane in a way that would disappoint anyone expecting a creature feature. A soldier sees something move at the edge of a tree-line that shouldn't have been able to move that way. A patrol notices that the dogs in a nearby village stopped barking 3 nights in a row at the same time. A sentry hears a voice call his name from outside the wire when he's the only one on the post. These reports rarely come with conclusions. They come with discomfort. And the discomfort outlasts the deployment. The case I want to walk through tonight is one I've sat with for about 4 years. I came across it through a chain of 2 intermediaries. A retired infantry officer who knew one of the men involved, and the man himself, who eventually agreed to speak with me on the condition that the location be obscured and the unit not be named. I've honored both of those conditions. The base in this story I'll be calling FOB Kestrel. It's not the real name. The country and the year I'll leave deliberately vague, except to say it was a forward operating base in a desert mountain environment. The deployment was in the second half of the 2010s, and the unit had been in place for roughly 5 months when the incidents began. What makes this case worth telling isn't a single dramatic encounter. The way the thing, whatever it was, kept appearing without ever quite doing anything. It's the way the men on the towers began to change before anyone with authority noticed. And it's the way, by the end, the East Tower was effectively abandoned without anyone at command level ever issuing an order to abandon it. That's the part that stayed with me. Not the sightings. The slow institutional drift away from a post that nobody wanted to admit had become unusable. FOB Kestrel sat on a low rise at the eastern edge of a wide valley. The terrain to the north was broken. Rock outcrops, dry water courses, scrub. To the south, the ground sloped down toward a road that connected two small villages. To the east, which is the direction that matters for this story, the land flattened out into roughly 600 meters of open ground before rising into a series of small ridges. Standard defensive geography. Open fields of fire on three sides. A controlled approach corridor through the village road on the fourth. The perimeter was textbook. Triple-strand concertina wire backed by HESCO barriers, with 4 observation towers positioned at the cardinal points. Each tower was manned around the clock in 2 soldier rotations during high alert periods and single soldier rotations during the rest of the deployment. By the time the incidents began, the base had been in single soldier rotation for about 11 weeks. The threat assessment had been downgraded twice. The local area was considered, in the language of the unit, quiet but not asleep. The East Tower was the one that overlooked the open ground and the distant ridges. It was the most boring post on the base. Nothing approached from the east. There was no road, no village, no foot traffic, no livestock. The men who pulled shifts there generally considered it the easy duty. You sat, you scanned, you stayed awake, you came down. 6 hours and you were done. The man I spoke with, I'll call him Reyes, which isn't his name, was a sergeant at the time responsible for the night rotations on the east and north towers. He was the one who noticed, before anyone else did, that something was changing in the way his soldiers came down from the east post. It wasn't anything they said, he told me. It was the way they took the ladder. You watch enough guys come down a tower ladder, you learn what tired looks like, what bored looks like, what spooked looks like. This was something else. They came down like they didn't want to turn their backs on the top of the ladder. That was the first thing. The first formal report of anything unusual at the East Tower came from a private named Hollis, about 3 weeks before the incident in the cold open. Hollis was a quiet kid from the Midwest, a strong shooter, well-liked, not prone to embellishment. He came down from a midnight to 6 shift and told Reyes, casually, that he thought he had seen a dog out past the wire. Reyes asked him what kind of dog. Hollis said he couldn't tell. It was too far out. Maybe 450 meters. It had been standing still, facing the tower, for about 20 minutes. Then it had moved off, north along the ridge. Reyes asked him why he hadn't reported it. Hollis said he had reported it, to himself in his head, about 4 times during the shift, and each time he decided it wasn't worth a radio call because the animal wasn't doing anything. It wasn't approaching the wire. It wasn't displaying threat behavior. It was just standing. This is the kind of thing that, in a quiet sector, doesn't generate paperwork. Reyes made a mental note and moved on. Stray dogs in that region were common. The villages had a substantial population of feral animals, and they wandered widely. The only thing that nagged at him, he said later, was the distance. 450 meters was a long way for a single animal to stand still and watch a tower for 20 minutes. Dogs in that area didn't tend to do that. They came in close, scavenging, or they kept moving. 2 nights later, a different soldier, a specialist named Whitaker, came down from the same tower and asked Reyes, almost in passing, if anyone else had been seeing animals out east. Reyes said Hollis had mentioned a dog. Whitaker nodded slowly and said he'd seen what he thought was a dog too. Same general area. Same posture. Standing, facing the tower, not moving. Reyes asked how long. Whitaker said about an hour. That was the second thing. Over the next 10 days, the East Tower generated 5 more informal reports of the same general nature. A figure, described variously as a dog, a coyote, a small person crouching, and in one case, something I couldn't really classify, appearing at a distance of between 300 and 500 meters east of the wire, holding position for extended periods, then moving off. None of the reports rose to the level of a formal incident. There was no threat behavior. No approach. No probing of the perimeter. No attempt to engage. The figure simply appeared, watched, and eventually left. What unsettled Reyes was not the sightings themselves but the consistency of the descriptions in the parts that mattered, and the inconsistency in the parts that should have been easy. The position was always the same, roughly the same bearing from the tower, roughly the same distance. The behavior was always the same, stationary, oriented toward the tower, prolonged observation, eventual departure. But the identification was never the same. Each soldier described something slightly different. One said it was clearly a dog. Another said it was definitely too large to be a dog. A third said he had thought it was a child until he had used the optics, and then he had stopped describing what he had seen, and asked instead if he could be reassigned off the East Tower. That last soldier was a corporal named Bauer. Reyes denied the reassignment request because there was no procedural basis for it. You didn't move soldiers off posts because they were uncomfortable. You moved them if they were sick, injured, or if there was a documented threat. None of those conditions applied. Bauer pulled 3 more East Tower shifts after that conversation. After the third one, he stopped speaking unless directly addressed. Reyes noticed it but attributed it to the general fatigue of a long deployment. He told me later that he should have noticed it sooner, and that he thinks about it more than he'd like to. About a month into the pattern, somebody finally raised the obvious question. Why wasn't the thing showing up on thermal? The East Tower was equipped with a standard handheld thermal optic. It wasn't fixed equipment. It was an issued device that the tower soldiers signed for at the start of the shift and turned in at the end. The optics were maintained, calibrated, and in regular use across the base. They worked. There was no question about that. They picked up animals, vehicles, personnel, even the residual heat signature of recently occupied ground if you knew what you were looking for. But on the East Tower, when soldiers tried to use the thermal to confirm the figure they were seeing in normal optics, they got nothing. No heat signature. No outline. No differentiation from the ambient ground temperature. The first soldier to report this, a sergeant named Park, tested the device twice during his shift to make sure it was working. He scanned other parts of the perimeter, picked up animals at comparable distances, picked up a patrol vehicle moving on the southern road, picked up his own boots when he pointed the device at them. The optic was functioning correctly. He then scanned the bearing where he had been seeing the figure. Nothing. He scanned again 2 minutes later. Nothing. Park made an entry in the tower log. The entry read in its entirety, *2340. Thermal returns negative on observed figure, bearing 087, distance approximate 400 m. Figure visible in standard optics. Cause undetermined. That log entry was the first piece of paper that anyone outside the tower rotation actually read. The base intelligence officer, a captain whose name I'm leaving out, came up to the East Tower the following evening to see for himself. He spent 4 hours on the post. He didn't see anything. The figure didn't appear. He came down, told Reyes that the tower rotation was probably picking up an environmental artifact. A rock formation in low light, an animal that was too cold to register on thermal, maybe even a localized atmospheric effect, and recommended that the soldiers be briefed on the limits of nighttime perception. The briefing was conducted. The figure appeared again the following night. What I want to do for the next part of this account is describe something that the official record doesn't really capture, because it didn't happen in any single moment or any single report. It happened across the rotation as a whole, and only became visible to Reyes when he stepped back and looked at his men as a group. The soldiers who pulled East Tower shifts were becoming different people. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody had a breakdown. Nobody refused duty. Nobody filed a complaint. The change was quieter than that. The men slept worse. They ate less in the dining facility, or they ate alone instead of with their friends. They were slower to laugh. They were faster to get irritated by small things. A misplaced piece of gear, a delayed mail call, a joke that didn't land. Hollis, who had been one of the more sociable soldiers in the platoon, became withdrawn enough that his squad leader asked Reyes whether something had happened at home. Nothing had happened at home. Hollis just didn't want to talk anymore. Bauer stopped going to the gym. Park, who was normally the loudest man in the chow hall, started taking his meals back to his quarters. Whitaker developed a habit of checking his weapons chamber repeatedly, 5, 6, 7 times in a row, before going on shift. He didn't seem to notice he was doing it. None of this was dramatic enough to flag in a formal sense. Deployments do this to people. Long rotations in austere environments produce exactly these kinds of behavioral shifts, and any officer or NCO who's done the job for long enough has seen all of it before. What made it different in this case, Reyes said, was that it was concentrated in one rotation. The men who pulled North, South, and West Tower duty were fine. The men who pulled East Tower duty were not. He raised this with the platoon sergeant. The platoon sergeant raised it with the first sergeant. The first sergeant raised it with the company commander. The company commander asked whether anyone had refused duty, filed a complaint, or shown a clinical indicator. The answer to all 3 questions was no. The matter was filed for monitoring and not escalated further. That was about a week before the night in the cold open. The corporal in the East Tower on the night of the radio call was named Daniels. He was 22, 2 years in service, a clean record, well regarded by his peers. He was not one of the soldiers who had previously reported anomalies on the East Post. This was in fact only his 4th shift on that tower. The shift began normally. He drew his thermal optic, signed for it, climbed the ladder, relieved the previous soldier, and conducted his standard scan of the perimeter. He logged a clean handover at 2200. The first 3 hours of the shift were quiet. He logged hourly observation reports at 2300, 0000, and 0100, all negative. At approximately 0215, according to his later account, he saw the figure. It was in the position the others had described, bearing roughly 087, distance roughly 400 meters. It was, in his words, standing the way a person stands when they're waiting for something. He couldn't describe it more clearly than that. He couldn't tell in normal optics whether it was a dog or a man or something else. It didn't matter to him at that point. What mattered was that it was there, and he had heard enough rumors in the platoon to know what he was looking at. He raised the thermal optic. He got nothing. The bearing where the figure stood returned the same ambient temperature as the ground around it. He lowered the thermal. The figure was still there. He raised the thermal again. Nothing. He made the radio call. What he didn't include in the radio call, and what he only told Reyes later, was that during the 30 seconds between the call and the flare, the figure moved. It didn't approach. It didn't retreat. It rotated. It turned slowly in place until it was no longer facing the tower. It was facing south, toward the road, toward the village. When the flare went up, the figure was gone. Daniels spent the remaining 4 minutes of his last clear thought sequence trying to find it again in the optics. He scanned north, east, south. He went back to thermal. He went back to normal. He couldn't find anything. The illumination flare burned its full duration and faded. When the light died, Daniels sat down on the floor of the tower with his back against the sandbags, because, as he told Reyes, he had become certain, without being able to explain why, that the figure had not moved away. It had only stopped being visible. He did not get up again until the relief came. Daniels was taken off the rotation the following morning. The official reason on the paperwork was fatigue-related performance concern, which is the standard administrative phrasing for a soldier who needs to be pulled from a duty without anyone wanting to commit to a more specific reason. He spent 2 days resting, was evaluated by the medic, was cleared, and was returned to general duties. He was not put back on the East Tower. He also did not talk about what he had seen. Not to Reyes, not to his squad leader, not to anyone in the platoon. He gave a brief statement the morning after the incident, which Reyes read once and then never saw again because it was filed up the chain. The statement, Reyes said, was 3 short paragraphs. It contained no description of the figure beyond what was already in the radio log. The most specific sentence in it was the one Daniels had said to the relief. Asterisk, it wasn't doing anything. That's the problem. Asterisk, the intelligence officer came up to the East Tower again the following night. He stayed for the full shift this time. Nothing happened. The night after that, a different soldier was assigned to the East Post. He reported a figure at approximately 0300, bearing 087, distance approximately 400 meters. He requested no illumination. He simply logged it. He came down at the end of his shift and put in a request for reassignment off tower duty entirely, citing accumulated fatigue. The request was granted without comment. Over the next 3 weeks, the East Tower rotation became increasingly difficult to staff. There was never an order, never a refusal, never a formal acknowledgement that anything was wrong. But the soldiers who were scheduled for that post began finding reasons to swap. The schedule began showing more and more frequent rotations of the same 2 or 3 men who hadn't yet been spooked. Eventually, even those men began asking, quietly, whether they could be put on a different tower. By the end of the 5th month of the deployment, the East Tower was being manned by whoever could be made to do it. By the end of the 6th, the rotation had been quietly restructured so that observation of the eastern perimeter was being conducted primarily from a roving foot patrol along the inside of the wire, with the tower itself manned only during daylight hours. No one ever issued an order to stop using the East Tower at night. It simply stopped being used. When I first heard this account, the detail that caught me wasn't the figure. It was the bearing. The way every soldier independently described the same vector, east roughly 087, and the same distance band roughly 400 meters. That kind of consistency is unusual in this category of report. Soldiers seeing things in low light at long range will typically produce a scatter of descriptions and positions. The fact that this one converged so tightly suggested either a real environmental feature that the men were repeatedly misinterpreting, or something that wasn't an environmental feature at all but was reliably present in the same place. I spent some time looking into the geography of the area, to the extent I could without naming it. The region had a long military history that predated the deployment in question by several decades. There had been Soviet activity in the area during their own war in the country. There had been smaller engagements involving local forces both before and after. I'm not going to claim that any of this is directly related to the incidents at FOB Kestrel. I don't have evidence for that. What I will say is that the area east of the base, in the direction of the ridges, contained at least one site that had been used as a temporary outpost during the Soviet period and abandoned afterward. The site was visible on overhead imagery. It sat almost exactly on the bearing the soldiers had been describing. I asked Reyes whether anyone in the unit had been briefed on the historical use of that area. He said no. The intelligence packages they received before deployment had covered current threat assessments and recent activity. Older history wasn't part of the briefing, and there was no particular reason it would have been. Soldiers don't get told about every abandoned position from previous wars in their operational area. There would be too many. Most of them are irrelevant. I also spoke, through the same intermediary who introduced me to Reyes, with one other person who had served at a different base in the same general region 2 years earlier. He described, without prompting, a pattern of observations at his own base that overlapped with the Kestrel reports in 2 specific details: figures observed at long range from a single tower, and a failure of those figures to register on thermal optics. He did not describe behavioral deterioration in his rotation, but he said the tower in question had also been informally downgraded over the course of his deployment. I want to be careful here. 2 reports do not make a pattern. The men involved did not know each other. Their units were different. The bases were a considerable distance apart. The similarity could be coincidence, or it could be a function of the kind of environmental conditions that produce these misperceptions in this kind of terrain. I'm not making a claim. I'm noting an overlap. There was one more thread I pulled on, and I'll mention it briefly because it's the kind of detail that tends to be either dismissed or overweighted, and I want to present it without doing either. In the villages south of FOB Kestrel, there were stories. The men I spoke with were aware of them only in fragments, mostly through the base interpreters, and mostly in the casual way that soldiers pick up local folklore during a deployment. The stories concerned a figure that was said to appear at the edges of inhabited places, never approaching, never speaking, never doing anything in particular. It was associated, in the local telling, with the watching of houses. It was not described as malevolent. It was described as patient. The phrase the interpreters used, when pressed, translated approximately as, the one who waits to be noticed. Reyes mentioned this to me only after I had asked him several times whether any local context had ever come up during the deployment. He said it had, but in passing, in the way that things come up when you're sitting around with interpreters on a slow afternoon and someone tells a story to pass the time. He hadn't connected it to the East Tower at the time. He connected it later, after he came home, when he was trying to make sense of what his men had been seeing. He said the connection might be nothing. The folklore might be unrelated. The figure on the ridge might have been a misperceived dog or a rock, or an artifact of fatigue and suggestion compounding across a rotation of tired men. He acknowledged all of that. He said it openly and without defensiveness. And then he said the thing that I think is the most honest summary of the entire case, and the reason I've spent 4 years thinking about it. He said, I can explain almost all of it. I can explain the sightings, I can explain the fatigue, I can explain why a tower gets quietly abandoned. I can even explain the thermal returns if I work at it. The part one can't explain is why my men, who were good men, came down off that ladder for 6 months looking like they didn't want to turn their backs on it. The reason I think this case is worth telling is not because of any single dramatic moment in it. There isn't one. Nobody was hurt. Nothing was photographed. No definitive sighting was ever recorded. The official documentation of the entire incident sequence amounts to a handful of log entries, a brief witness statement that's now buried in a deployment archive, and a quietly restructured tower rotation that no one ever explained in writing. What this case offers instead is a kind of slow, unresolved pressure. A figure that never approached. A thermal optic that never confirmed. A bearing that never varied. A group of soldiers who never broke, but who never quite came back from that rotation as the same men who started it. And a post that was never officially closed, but that nobody wanted to climb at night by the end of the deployment. These are the cases I find the hardest to set aside. The dramatic ones, the loud encounters, the close approaches, the clear sightings, are easier to categorize. You can file them as misidentification, as fatigue, as fear, as folklore. You can argue with them. The quiet ones are harder. The ones where nothing actually happens but the people involved still come away changed, are the ones that stay. I've thought a lot about Daniel's line. Asterisk, it wasn't doing anything. That's the problem. Asterisk, I think he was articulating something that the men on that tower had all been feeling for months without being able to put into words. Threats you can describe are threats you can prepare for. A figure that stands 400 meters out and watches you, and doesn't register on your equipment, and doesn't approach, and doesn't retreat, and doesn't acknowledge being seen, that isn't a threat in any sense that your training prepared you for. It's an open question with no procedure attached to it. And open questions, in an environment where your survival depends on the closure of every variable, are corrosive in a way that fear isn't. The men on that tower weren't afraid in the conventional sense. They were uncategorized. They were watching something that didn't fit the schema they were trained to apply to it, and they were watching it for hours at a time, alone in the dark with no protocol to fall back on. That, I think, is what wore them down. Not the figure itself. The unanswered question of what to do with it. FOB Kestrel was eventually closed. Not because of these incidents. The closure was part of a broader drawdown in the region, and would have happened regardless. The unit rotated home. The men involved went on with their careers. Most of them are still in service. Some are not. Reyes left the military about 2 years after the deployment, for reasons that he says had nothing to do with the East Tower, and which I believe him about, mostly. He told me one more detail at the end of our last conversation, and I've been turning it over ever since. He said that about a year after the unit rotated home, he ran into Daniels, the corporal from the cold open, at a base in the United States. They had a beer together. They talked about ordinary things. Toward the end of the conversation, Reyes asked him, carefully, whether he ever thought about the East Tower. Daniels said he didn't think about it. He said it the way you say something you've practiced saying. Reyes let it go. As they were leaving, Daniels stopped at the door and said, without turning around, "The part one can't get past is that it turned south before it disappeared. I don't know why that's the part, but it is." Then he walked out and Reyes never saw him again. I've thought about that detail a lot. The turn south. Toward the road. Toward the village. I don't know what to do with it. I don't have a frame for it. Might mean nothing. The figure, if it was a figure, might have simply changed orientation for reasons that have no significance. Or it might mean that whatever had been watching the tower for 6 months had, at the end, decided to look at something else. I don't know which of those is worse. I'm not sure it matters. I want to close with something a little more personal because I think this case deserves it. When I first started collecting these accounts, I expected the hard ones to be the violent ones. The contact reports. The encounters with clear adversaries. The stories where something visible and identifiable happened and people had to respond to it. Those, I assumed, would be the ones that stayed with the men who lived through them. What I've learned over a lot of years now is that those aren't the hard ones. The hard ones are the cases like FOB Kestrel. The ones where nothing happened on paper and where the people involved came home with no medals and no scars and no clear story to tell, and where the only thing they brought back was the memory of standing in a tower at 3 in the morning looking at something they couldn't explain, that wouldn't go away, and that nobody in their chain of command would acknowledge as a real problem. Those are the men who, 20 years later, will tell you the story in fragments if you catch them on the right night. They'll downplay it. They'll laugh about it. They'll say it was probably nothing. And then, somewhere in the conversation, they'll say a sentence that doesn't fit the laughter. A small, specific detail they've been carrying for 2 decades, and you'll realize that the story never really ended for them. That's the part one find hardest to walk away from. Not the figure on the ridge. The man at the door 20 years later who still can't get past the turn south. I don't have a conclusion for this one. I don't think there is one. I just have the account and the men who lived it, and the empty tower at the eastern edge of a base that doesn't exist anymore, and a bearing 087 that I think about more often than I'd like to. Thanks for listening.